Okay you guys, so we need to talk, and I mean right now, because what just happened between Rick Ross, Jay-Z, and Kareem Biggs Burke is honestly one of the most jaw-dropping moments the culture has seen in a very long time. And I know that sounds like a big claim, but stick with me, because by the end of this video, y'all are going to understand exactly why the whole internet is losing their minds over this one. Rick Ross went on a rant so bold, so reckless, so out of pocket, that less than 24 hours later, this man completely switched his tone, changed his energy, and started speaking about Biggs like he had just seen a ghost. And now everybody, and I mean everybody, is saying the same 3 letters. HOV. So today, we are breaking it all down. Every clip, every comment, every whisper, every rumor about that phone call that people are saying quietly ended the beef before it could even start. Now let me set the stage for y'all real quick, because if you missed the beginning of this, none of the ending is going to make sense. It all kicked off when Rick Ross hopped on live and started going crazy on Rory and Mel. And listen, we've seen Rosie do his little rant thing plenty of times before. That's honestly part of his brand at this point. But this time, something felt different. This time, it wasn't just petty shots. This time, he crossed a line that a lot of people in the industry usually leave alone. Because Rick Ross didn't just come for Mel, Rick Ross came for Mel's brother. And Mel's brother is not just anybody. Mel's brother is Kareem Biggs Burke, one of the co-founders of Roc-A-Fella Records. Y'all know where I'm going with this. That's Jay-Z's Day One. That's HOV's brother. That's The Rock. And once that name got mentioned, the entire tone of this situation flipped upside down. Now Rick Ross, on his live, was going in. He was calling folks minions. He was calling them glazers. He was calling them peons. He was saying Biggs' own brother was sucking on Biggs' brother, and I'm not even going to repeat the rest of it because it was that disrespectful. He was saying, and I quote in spirit, that the streets don't love y'all, ain't nobody love y'all, and let Big Spurt know the boss is waiting for him to come kiss the ring. Y'all, come kiss the ring. That is the kind of language you use when you truly believe there is no one on earth who can check you. That's the kind of energy a man puts out when he thinks he sits at the very top of the food chain. And here is where the story starts to get spicy, because Rick Ross didn't stop there. He kept pushing. He started digging into Biggs' past. He brought up old federal cases. He brought up money. He brought up taxes. He was literally saying how he went broke. He ain't pay his taxes? He got caught with 20 bags of weed? Y'all, on a live stream. In front of the whole world. About a man who is deeply, deeply respected in this industry. And this is the part one need everybody to understand, because this is where the whole thing shifts. Kareem Biggs Burke is not a rapper. He's not a podcast host. He's not out here beefing on Instagram. Biggs is a mogul. Biggs helped build one of the most powerful record labels in the entire history of hip-hop. Roc-A-Fella isn't just some old logo on a chain. That empire birthed Jay-Z, it birthed a fashion line, it birthed a film company, it birthed a lifestyle that reshaped the culture forever. So when Rick Ross decided to drag Biggs' name onto the timeline, it wasn't a diss anymore. It was a declaration. And once fans realized that, the tone online completely shifted. People stopped laughing. People started saying, Rosie, what are you doing? Do you understand who you just poked at? Because in this industry, there are certain names you do not swing at without expecting the whole architecture behind them to swing back. But of course, Rick Ross being Rick Ross, he kept it going. And this is where the drama really cranked up, because it wasn't just about him talking anymore. He was also propping up Dame Dash. And y'all know the history there. Dame and Jay-Z have had a long, complicated, well-documented fallout. So when Rick Ross starts elevating Dame while simultaneously going after Biggs, some people online started to whisper, wait a minute. Is this bigger than a rant? Is Rick Ross deliberately picking a side? And that whisper spread. And it spread fast. Because in an industry where alliances mean everything, choosing sides publicly is a very expensive decision. A very, very expensive decision. Now let's talk about the moment everybody is still replaying, because this is the piece that made the internet completely lose its mind. Less than 24 hours after Rick Ross said all of that, less than 24 hours after he told Biggs to come kiss the ring, Rick Ross showed up on camera again. But this time? Different Ross. Different energy. Different tone. Different everything. Gone was the loud, confident, chest-out delivery. Gone were the peons and the minions and the glazers. Instead, there he was, measured, careful, almost soft-spoken, dropping one calm line into the atmosphere. Beautiful day to be a boss. And that was it. That was the whole message. And y'all, the internet exploded. Because in the world of body language, in the world of tone reading, in the world of picking up on what a public figure is really trying to say, that one sentence hit like a full retraction wrapped in a smile. And that is when the rumor everybody is talking about started spreading. That is when the phone call theory was born. Fans immediately jumped to one conclusion. Someone called Rick Ross. Someone with power. Someone with weight. Someone whose voice you cannot ignore. And of course, the name on everyone's lips was Jay-Z. Now let me be very fair here, because I do not want anybody running around saying I said something I did not say. There is no confirmed proof, none whatsoever, that Jay-Z personally picked up a phone and called Rick Ross. That is speculation. That is fan theory. That is street conversation. But even accounting for all of that, the switch in Rick Ross's demeanor was so sudden, so complete, and so obvious that it is almost impossible to convince anyone that nothing happened behind the scenes. Something clearly shifted. The only question is who moved the pieces. Now while all of this is unfolding, the culture is having a full-blown meltdown on social media. Timelines are on fire. Hip-hop pages are running non-stop coverage. Podcast hosts are pulling emergency episodes. Everybody has a theory. Everybody has a take. Some folks are saying Rick Ross took himself out of his own weight class. Others are saying Rick Ross was making a business move to align himself with Dame in a bigger play we don't understand yet. Others are saying it was just a rant and everybody is reading too much into it. But the one theory that keeps rising back to the top, the theory that will not die no matter how many times people try to bury it, is that a very quiet, very powerful, very direct message reached Rick Ross, and after that message, Ross made a choice. And that choice was to walk it back without ever admitting he was walking it back. Because in this industry, admitting you were wrong is expensive. But repositioning your tone? Repositioning your tone is free. And that is the genius of what Rick Ross did next, y'all. He never once said the words, "I apologize." He never once said the words, "I take it back." He didn't record a formal retraction video. He didn't tweet a long paragraph. He didn't post a screenshot of a note in his phone. Instead, he simply switched frequencies. And a lot of people believe he even privately reached out through channels. Reports started swirling that Rose retracted his statements to Biggs. That he backed off. That he moved the smoke away from the rock. And when you stack that up next to the sudden tone change, next to the beautiful day to be a boss moment, next to the fact that he stopped mentioning Biggs almost entirely, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It looked, walked, and sounded like a man who received a message he could not refuse. Now here is where it gets even crazier, because we have to talk about the layers on top of the layers. Rick Ross is not just some rapper who wandered into this. Rick Ross has a history with Def Jam. Rick Ross has a history with the same corporate structures Jay-Z helped shape. Rick Ross has spent years building relationships across a network of executives, labels, publishers, and partners, many of whom are directly connected to the very people he just publicly went after. So when he decided to take shots at Biggs, he wasn't just insulting a person. He was potentially threatening years of business infrastructure. And in the music industry, business infrastructure is everything. Business infrastructure is the difference between headlining stadiums and headlining Tuesday night at the local lounge. Business infrastructure is why some artists get pushed for decades and others quietly disappear. So the moment Rick Ross realized what he actually walked into, the smart move became the only move. And the smart move was to lower the temperature. Let me pause right here because I want to know what you guys are thinking. Drop it in the comments below. Do you honestly believe Jay-Z reached out to Rick Ross directly? Or do you think Ross figured out on his own that he had crossed a line? Because these two theories send this story in two completely different directions. If HOV made the call, that tells us The Roc is still very much active behind the curtain, still watching, still moving pieces on a board most of us cannot see. But if Ross backed down on his own, that tells us something even bigger. That tells us the weight of the Roc-A-Fella legacy is so heavy that people self-correct just by hearing the name Biggs. Either way, this is huge. Either way, this changes how we read every single rap beef going forward. So tell me. Drop your theory. I am reading every single comment. Alright, moving on, because there is more, and honestly this next part is what really pushed me to make this video. See, everybody has been so focused on the Jay-Z angle that they've been sleeping on the Biggs angle. And that's a mistake. Because Biggs, Kareem Biggs Burke, is not just Jay-Z's business partner. Biggs is the type of figure whose reputation is built on quiet respect. This is a man who did his time when the feds came calling. This is a man who never opened his mouth, never pointed a finger, never dragged anybody else's name into his situation. In a culture that constantly rewards loudness, Biggs became a legend through silence. So when Rick Ross publicly rattled off Biggs' business, Biggs' cases, Biggs' history, he wasn't just being disrespectful. He was violating one of the unspoken codes of the industry, which is that you do not mock a man who kept his mouth shut when the walls closed in. And a lot of OGs, a lot of real ones from that era, they did not take kindly to that at all. Which is another reason people started saying somebody had to check him. Now here is a wild curveball nobody is talking about enough. Rick Ross himself has a very well-documented past as a correctional officer before he became one of the biggest names in rap. And I know, we have been through this conversation many, many times before, and Ross has more or less made peace with that chapter of his life. But when you're the one out here dragging another man for federal cases while your own history includes standing on the opposite side of the fence, the internet is going to remind you. And remind you they did. Because within hours of the Biggs comments, screenshots started flying, old photos got recirculated, and the entire timeline turned into a giant reminder. So when he came back with that softer tone the next day, a lot of people believe he wasn't just responding to Jay-Z. He was responding to the culture itself. To the collective reaction. To the pressure of 100 million eyes suddenly asking one question. Rosie, are you sure this is the fight you want? And this next detail is the piece that ties this whole story together, so listen very carefully. When Rick Ross was asked whether he would take $500,000 in cash or a dinner with Jay-Z for business advice, Rosie didn't even hesitate. He said, I'm taking the dinner. And then he explained it. He said, in the first 10 minutes, I'd already have 20 million in questions. By the time the oysters begin to arrive, I'm sure it'll be a $40 million conversation. Y'all, this is the same man. This is the same Rick Ross who publicly acknowledged just how valuable a single conversation with HOV could be. This is the same Rick Ross who once said Jay-Z pulled him aside back in 2008, before his second album, and taught him how to shift from writing to a handful of beats to writing to every beat that could work. That advice, according to Ross himself, changed his career. Changed his output. Changed his level as an artist. So for that same Rick Ross to turn around and take shots at Jay-Z's inner circle? That is why the story hits so different. That is why people are so obsessed with this. Because it feels like watching someone bite the hand that quietly fed them the recipe for greatness. And this is where I want us to zoom out for a second, because too often in these situations we just focus on the drama. But there is a lesson buried in here, and I think a lot of us need to hear it. The lesson is this. Money doesn't buy you out of hierarchy. Fame doesn't buy you out of hierarchy. Chart position doesn't buy you out of hierarchy. In every industry, especially this one, there are levels. There are structures. There are unspoken rules about who you can and cannot poke at without setting off a chain reaction. Rick Ross has piles of money. Rick Ross has hits. Rick Ross has a mansion so big it has its own economy. But none of that shielded him from the moment he stepped out of pocket. None of it. Because business runs on relationships, and relationships run on respect, and respect runs deeper than any bank account. That is why the pivot happened so fast. That is why the tone changed so completely. That is why Beautiful Day to Be a Boss felt less like a boast and more like a peace offering. Now some of y'all may still be wondering, well, what did Biggs actually say through all of this? And here is the crazy part. Biggs said almost nothing. Biggs stayed silent. Biggs stayed above the fray. Biggs didn't post a subliminal. Biggs didn't record a response. Biggs didn't hop on a podcast. Because that's who Biggs is. He didn't have to. His name alone did the work. And that, my friends, is what real weight sounds like. Real weight doesn't need to answer. Real weight doesn't need to prove anything. Real weight is when a mogul's silence is louder than a rapper's rant. That is the energy Biggs radiated during this entire moment. And a lot of younger artists are watching this unfold and taking mental notes, because they're seeing in real time that in this business, the quietest man in the room can still be the loudest voice in the story. Meanwhile, the culture continued to feast. Podcast hosts were dedicating entire episodes to the timeline of events. Blogs were breaking down every clip frame by frame. Reddit threads were multiplying by the hour. Instagram commentary pages were competing for who could get the story out first. And in the middle of it all, Rick Ross kept it moving with that boss energy, refusing to give the internet the outright apology it was hungry for. And you know what? Strategically, that was smart. Because a full-on public apology would have been branded as weakness for years. A quiet tone shift, though? A quiet tone shift can be spun as growth. A quiet tone shift can be spun as maturity. A quiet tone shift can be spun as I said what I said, but I'm also a grown man. So Ross found the middle lane, and he drove down it with his hazards on. And now for the biggest question of all, the one I know you clicked on this video hoping I would answer. Did Jay-Z actually make that phone call? Here is my honest, unfiltered take. We may never get a public confirmation. That is not how HOV moves. That is not how The Roc moves. That is not how legends of that caliber operate. They do not need to broadcast their reach. Their reach broadcasts itself. If Jay-Z did make that call, you and I will probably never see the receipts. But we don't need receipts to read the room. The tone change, the sudden softness, the retraction rumors, the strategic silence, the beautiful day to be a boss line, the disappearance of the Biggs jabs, the elevation of respectful language, all of it lines up too cleanly to be a coincidence. So while I cannot say for certain that HOV personally reached out, I can absolutely say that the outcome looked, sounded, and moved exactly the way a HOV intervention would move. Now, before I let y'all go, I want to leave you with one more thought. Because I think this story is going to keep unfolding for weeks, maybe months. There is a good chance we haven't seen the last twist yet. Rick Ross has never been the type to fully back down. Jay-Z has never been the type to fully forget. Dame Dash has never been the type to stay off alive. And Biggs, well, Biggs might stay quiet, but the people who love Biggs? They talk. So keep your eyes wide open, because at any moment, a new video could drop, a new interview could surface, a new podcast clip could go viral, and the whole board could shift again. This is not the end. This is the middle. And the middle is always where the best drama lives. And listen, before we get to the final wrap-up, I have to share one more angle that a lot of channels are conveniently glossing over, because it adds even more color to this whole story. Rick Ross, when he was really cooking on that live, name-dropped Dame Dash again and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he was going to get Dame going on Biggs' whole business history. Think about how bold that is. That is not a random rant. That is a coordinated shot. You do not just pull Dame Dash's name out of the sky in that moment unless you are aware, on some level, of the fracture that already exists between Dame, Jay-Z, and Biggs. So the moment Ross referenced Dame in the same breath as Biggs, the entire community started reading between the lines. People started saying, wait a second, is this a two-man play? Is Dame using Ross as a mouthpiece? Is Ross using Dame as cover? Or are two grown men just genuinely on the same page about how they feel about the current state of The Roc? We don't know. We may never know. But the fingerprints on this thing are wild. And another thing, y'all, we cannot forget the podcast angle in all of this. Because remember, this whole storm started because Rick Ross was going after Rory and Mel, who had recently, very publicly, split from Joe Budden and stepped away from a show that a lot of people considered untouchable. That is a whole separate saga, but it matters here, because Ross calling Rory and Mel Glazers on top of that whole exit made his rant feel less like a defense and more like an attack. He wasn't just insulting them for what they said. He was kicking them while they were already in a very awkward professional moment. And when he layered Biggs on top of that, it was like watching someone throw gasoline on a small fire and turn it into a wildfire. That's why the tone shift the next day hit so hard. Because the fire had grown so big, even the man who lit it had to step back from the heat. And let's not sleep on the cultural weight of this either. Because in the last few years, we have watched beef after beef after beef spiral out of control. We have watched entire careers get flipped upside down by one bad interview, one bad line, one bad life. So when Rick Ross, one of the biggest bosses in the game, publicly signals a de-escalation within 24 hours, that is a masterclass. Whether it was his own instinct, whether it was a phone call, whether it was his team pulling him aside and saying, "Rosie, cool it," the pivot itself is one of the smartest damage control moves we have seen in modern hip-hop. Most artists dig their heels in and lose everything defending the wrong hill. Rick Ross, whatever the cause, chose the boss move, which is to keep the crown on his head and the smoke away from his empire. So let me hear from you one more time in the comments. Do you think Rick Ross took an L on this one? Do you think he handled it like a grown man by dialing it down? Do you think Jay-Z pulled strings? Do you think Biggs deserves an apology, or do you think this whole thing was overblown? Give me your unfiltered thoughts, because I read them all, and honestly your takes always make these stories even better. If you enjoyed this deep dive, if you learned something new, or if you just want to keep up with every single move happening in the culture, please, 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 smack that like button. It really does help me out more than you know. Hit that subscribe button if you're new around here, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss a story, because trust me, I will always be back with the receipts, the timelines, and the tea nobody else is telling. Until next time, stay locked in, stay smart, and remember, in this game, the loudest voice is not always the most powerful one. Sometimes, one quiet phone call ends the whole war.